So let's jump in and start talking about idea versus execution versus market. So this is a great comment from Quora. We've slightly modified it here. An idea is not a mock-up is not a prototype is not a program is not a product is not a business, and a business is not profits. The Quora comment modifies this further to say that profits are not an exit and an exit is not happiness. Be that as it may, we won't touch on whether that's actually happiness or not. But the interesting thing about this is that when you kind of conceptualize this as a sort of state machine for one's ideas, you can actually see why it is that coming up with an idea is not the same as actually building a profitable business. It might take you a minute to come up with, some billion-dollar idea on a napkin, and then maybe a day to do a mock-up, a weekend to do a prototype. But as you start thinking about it, to actually get to a profitable business is so much more effort than just simply coming up with something and writing it on a napkin that they really aren't intercomparable. And this is really the distinction between an idea versus a profitable business that is worth keeping in mind. Any entrepreneur worth their salt has dozens, if not hundreds, of these napkin drawings. You should have hundreds of these billion-dollar ideas, quote unquote. And what you'll find is as you start pushing them through these various stages, as you start, especially when you get them to a prototype, and then later, this step from a business to profits, there's lots of things that sound good in practice, but that run into issues somewhere down the line. So the things that actually make it to profitable businesses are actually, pretty rare sorts of animals. So when you talk about the idea versus execution versus the market, the conventional wisdom is that the idea is everything. And that's why, there's this push for IP and for patent lawsuits. That's why there's actual trolls. And that's why a lot of people think that if, they deserve a percentage point or more of a company simply for coming up with a concept. This view is, generally looked on with disfavor in the Valley, in part because of this table over here. And the alternative view is something that you will hear over and over and over again if you come to the Valley, which is it's not the idea, it's execution. And here's Bob Metcalfe giving this concept in a paragraph form, basically about how it was sales rather than technology that built his business. And the thing about this is very useful for anybody who's new to a startup. If you're new to the concept of startups, you really should say this until it becomes tiresome. And it's certainly a mantra of sorts for people to sort of self-flagellate and remember that it's not what you can come up with, it's what you can actually ship. This can be overstated because if you've got a low-cost way to launch objects into space, that is certainly a good idea, right? That's something where, yes, I want to hear more. Versus an idea for a social network for pet owners, maybe that'll work, but it's all going to be about your user base and your traction and so on. The napkin plan for this doesn't mean anything. What means something is exactly how do you get those pet owners into the system? What is your cost of customer acquisition? What's your lifetime customer value? And various other metrics. It'll be a very metrics and execution-driven business versus this could be more of a technology-driven business. And the basic idea here, though, is that when you are at the inception stage, usually it's okay to be able to talk to other people about what you're doing. That said, be careful because it is true that on certain communities, yes, in Hacker News or possibly within classes on startups, for example, there will be a lot of people who are competent technically and are looking for a concept and are looking for something to execute on right then and there. That's unusual. Most environments are not like that. Most people have their own jobs. They have their own occupations already. You want to use your judgment on this. There's one school of thought that says keep everything secret. There's another school of thought that says tell everything to everyone. I think that 80-85%, yes, tell to people, but your absolute core jewels that you think somebody else could use, use your judgment there, right? That said, you can only really gain so much advantage out of stealth or secrecy, and the reason is that the moment that you actually launch, once you actually launch and once you actually ship a product, if it's actually getting traction, you're going to have to outrun everybody because there's going to be competitors that will arise. And if your only advantage is that you're smarter and you're more strategically minded, but you're not as fast, those guys who are faster will clone your idea and they will run faster than you. And that's what happened, for example, in search. Google, arguably, was a clone of other search engines. I mean, obviously it had better technology and exceeded. Facebook was arguably a clone of Friendster and MySpace. It came after, but it exceeded them. So those clones, if they execute better, people are only going to remember them. They're not going to remember, that Jonathan Abrams, came up with Friendster, or the people who did Alta Vista. I mean, people in the industry remember them, but the general public knows Facebook and Google, not the companies that they beat. So that's why, the execution is prized. It's really about who ultimately wins the space. The last take is also really worth thinking about. So we talked about the idea, we talked about the execution. The third is the market. And Marc Andreessen, who's somebody who's worth listening to, the founding partner of Andreessen Horowitz, invented, the Netscape browser, sold, his second company for quite a lot of money. So Marc is, his thesis is that the market is the most important, and that a startup that actually manages to do well in a large market, to actually serve that market's need, forces beyond the immediate startup, sort of pull it up. And so, sometimes that means all the personnel are swapped out, and it just becomes a vehicle where the initial concept was so good and the initial execution was so good that it got traction, and then maybe the actual engineering team or the sales team or whatever, it's like a body where every organ is replaced like 2 years in, 3 years in. Some companies are like that. Cisco is like that. Twitter is arguably like that, where the initial engineering group got it to work, but a totally different group of guys was required to actually scale up the service. And those are, kind of businesses where the traction and the market was so responsive that it sort of pulled the company up. And let's talk about this as sort of the trifecta: idea, execution, market. And now let's talk about how we will resolve that, that troika, which is actually the most important.